So I learned a great deal while experimenting with my hydrogen-oxygen torch, and I'd like to turn to a different gas. These are the cylinders I used for my hydrogen-oxygen torch. Remember, I was only willing to fill them up to about 500 psi because that's the pressure you get them from the store from. So it really doesn't hold that much gas. That's only about 35 atmospheres or so. I want to try making something out of CO2. In order to do that, I need something with a little more heft. This has a test pressure of 3,000 psi. It's used for a paintball and air gun. And all I really need to do is take this device and modify it a little bit. And I've got this device. Decided to keep this in case I wanted to burn anything or make any more limelight. But this will be the thing that I will use with this tank to fill it up, and I'll produce a CO2 generator, and I'll just keep filling this thing up with CO2 until I can't get any more in it. Now the difference between CO2 and hydrogen is that hydrogen is a compressed gas, which means that if this has got about a 500 ml capacity or whatever it is, I forget, I did a video on that, and that's 35 atmospheres. That means you can get a 16, 17 liters into this thing, not that much. Whereas with CO2, when it reaches a certain pressure around 830 to 840 psi, what it does is it liquefies in the cylinder. Then you can hold a tremendously larger amount because liquid CO2 is obviously much smaller in size than gaseous CO2. And you can put tremendous quantities of CO2 into a cylinder like this. And my ultimate goal then is to get enough CO2 that I can put this thing on it, which is called a dry ice horn. And if you expel all the CO2 rapidly, the cooling due to the expansion of the liquid CO2 will produce dry ice. So my ultimate goal is to generate dry ice. We'll see. It's going to take quite a while because I can only generate relatively small amounts of CO2, and then I have to do the normal pump in order to fill the thing up. So this is how I figure I'm going to set up a CO2 generation vessel. Essentially, I'll fill this with limestone, cover it, make it airtight, and then what I need is a way to put acid in one side without spraying myself in the face with acid, and to remove CO2 from the other side. So I'll show you how I thought to do that. So let's discuss my theory of the case here. We fill the bucket with limestone. We put a balloon on here. Those of you who are longtime viewers will recognize that as my transfer mechanism from my gas generator. We close this valve, which gives us the floor of a small chamber right here that we can fill with hydrochloric acid. Then we can close the upper valve. Wearing a face shield to make sure we don't wind up with a face full of acid, we then open this valve to discharge the acid into the chamber, generating CO2, which comes out in the balloon. Let's set this up. This is 1 pound, 454 grams of sodium bicarbonate. So that is a monovalent sodium salt, NaHCO3. We're going to call this my first production run. That's 100 mLs. That should be enough to produce in excess of 20 liters of CO2 again. Let's try it. The top of the bucket bulges rather alarmingly during this process. You'll notice the balloon doesn't stay up like the hydrogen balloon does because CO2 is heavier than air, so the balloon has a tendency to fall over. Astute viewers of the channel, and I'm sure you're all very astute, will recognize the sort of water lock that I made back in episode 64 for my hydrogen-oxygen torch, now to be repurposed, if you will, as a drying chamber for my CO2. Hopefully that won't add too much resistance when I'm trying to pump. Said I'm going away for a couple weeks, and this is the most portable thing I have. Obviously, kind of hard to go on vacation and take the big can. Even the little can's kind of a pain. So I'll just pack up my troubles. And since I am American, I'm going to go with large serving sizes so I don't have to mess around with buying little boxes. So anyway, updated progress report. Sometime after I've got that bottle filled with CO2, we'll be back to see where we are. There's at least theoretically a reasonable amount of liquid CO2 in the bottom of this. So let's just see if we can let some of it out. This will tell us whether or not, well, that was cool. That was clearly a liquid CO2 that immediately became gas. So we're just going to keep pumping here. We're going to fill this baby up, and then we're going to see what happens when we release the pressure suddenly. Well, after another big pump, let me show you my pressure in this thing. So unfortunately my pressure has exceeded the gauge capacity. I'm sure that's again because I've got contaminating oxygen and nitrogen in there, and I guess I could maybe burp it out. The thing I'm worried about, I'm sure this system can handle it. The test pressure on this tank is 3,000 psi. That doesn't necessarily mean that the rest of my setup can handle it. But the fact that I can't see what the pressure is now makes me a little concerned. So I think what I'm going to do is put this back in the freezer and produce as much liquid CO2 as I can, and then see what happens when I let it all loose in one big blast. The amount of CO2 in here is about 99 liters. There's just about 200 grams of CO2 in here. I calculated this thing would hold 500 grams or so of CO2, so I'm really not even halfway there. It's that gauge pressure that's worrying me. If I don't make dry ice with this attempt, I'll start burping the nitrogen and see if I can get the pressure under better control. Well, no time like the present. Check out that result. Dry ice, baby. Ah, the pause that refreshes. That's actually it's actually a pretty significant result. You could also get a nice shot of the endothermy associated with that. That pulled a lot of heat out of this bottle. So that result pretty much speaks for itself. Thanks very much for watching. Please feel free to like and subscribe if you want. I might try to figure out a way to scale this up because I damn near broke my back with the bicycle pump. Feel free to tell your friends about that one. And if they don't want to watch, that's fine too. Anyway, thanks very much for watching. Have a great day. Let's talk about a couple things. The first one is, this is the first video I've ever seen on YouTube where someone made dry ice out of CO2 that they generated and pressurized. The only make dry ice video on YouTube that I can find is something that King Iran did about 6 years ago, and essentially he put a pillowcase over the horn of a CO2 fire extinguisher. It's a 15-pound extinguisher. That thing retails for $379, and even though he says that a fire extinguisher company gave it to him, that's probably not a viable option for most people. So let's talk finances for a minute. So my gas filler cost me $54.50. I could have done it for cheaper if I had just repurposed this one. This thing cost me $12, and this higher pressure gauge cost me $10. So I could have done that for $22, except that I wanted to keep this thing. My horn cost me $45.59. Again, this thing was $12. I could have gone cheaper if I hadn't used brass. This particular piece of pipe right here alone cost me $10. So if I had gone with iron or steel, I could have done it for quite a bit less. My CO2 generator cost me $35.95. Most of that cost was in these two valves here. Those two valves were $10 by themselves. And then, of course, my tank. This tank was $22. So if you total that up, the total cost was $136.04 for everything but the tank. In other words, $158 if you include the tank. So let's talk about supplies now, because we know that the capital is one thing, but the supplies is the other. And I don't know how much it costs to fill up a CO2 fire extinguisher, but it's got to be, I don't know, maybe 20 bucks. So let's call it $1.50 per pound of CO2. As far as muriatic acid goes, I spent $10 for muriatic acid. That's 1 gallon, and that 1 gallon is enough to produce 2 kilograms of CO2. So 2 kilograms, about a little over 2.5 pounds, so I would need 6 of these, $60 to produce 15 pounds of CO2. Baking soda, each pound of baking soda will produce 121 liters of CO2, 1,100 grams. So that'd be about 200 grams. A 5-pound bag will produce 1,100 grams. So a little over a kilogram, so let's call it 1.5 pounds. I'd need 10 of these bags to produce 15 pounds of CO2 approximately. And this thing cost me $8. So I'd need $80 worth of baking soda, and I would need in the range of, 80 bucks of muriatic acid, a lot more than the King of Random would have spent to refill his fire extinguisher. However, of course, you got to not neglect the cool factor of making your own CO2 and producing it. Lastly, this would be considered a supply. I'm not counting this part because I made it for my hydrogen oxygen torch, but my balloons are $1.50 each, and the bag was free. I don't even know where it came from. So anyway, that's kind of where we are. I'm gonna give it a rest there and get this thing online, and then I'm gonna do another video next week about sort of the geeky stuff about this gas which turns to a liquid when it's under pressure.